was Muhammad?
Muhammad was the last prophet of Allah. He established the religion of Islam and was born in 570 AD and lived till 632 AD. Many of his followers were not opposed to using force to spread his religion, and so over the course of 200 years the entire Arabian Peninsula was Islamic.
Can you describe what the Muslim world was like before the Crusades?
The great Muslim empire quickly sprung up after Muhammad, but by the start of the 11th century and the Crusades it was not the case anymore. The great Abbasid Empire was now controlled by many shadow figures. The Seljuk Turks were spreading their control over Anatolia further, and the Fatimid Empire was falling. Because of this, the Turks managed to take control over the entire Arabic Peninsula and began to approach the Byzantine Emperor. As a result, Alexius, Emperor of the Byzantines, decided to send Pope Urban a letter begging him for help.
Why did the Muslims become involved in the Crusades?
The Muslims became involved in the Crusades because at the time they held control over Jerusalem, and when the Christians began to start to walk through their land and attempt to take their cities, the emirs of each city or town decided they would stop this and decided to protect their cities. However, they did not help each other in protecting each other's cities, which ultimately led to the downfall that caused the Christians to win the First Crusade.
Who was al-Harari?
Al-Harari was a Muslim Qadi judge from Damascus who walked all the way from Damascus to Baghdad to ask the Caliph of Islam for help in fighting the Crusaders. Legend tells that he walked in on the 29th day of Ramadan and began to eat, causing a commotion which resulted in people paying attention to his message. Sadly, nothing was done despite his best efforts, and which is why the Crusaders managed to hold on to Jerusalem till the Third Crusade.
Explain al-Harari's role in the Crusades.
The main role that al-Harari played in the Crusades was to tell the citizens of Baghdad about the loss of the city of Jerusalem, and to attempt to persuade the Caliph to send a force to retrieve the city. The Caliph promised to brainstorm ideas, however this was an empty promise and the city of Jerusalem was not recovered.
Who was Nur-ad-Din Zengi?
Nur-ad-Din Zengi was the emir of Aleppo and Mosul and decided to take back part of the Holy Lands. He created an army that was very well trained and prepared, and his control over his Turks was impeccable. As a result, he did manage to take back the city of Edessa in 1144, however he was assassinated the next year. His methods were so good that Saladin, who eventually would take back the city of Jerusalem, followed them several decades later.
Explain Nur-ad-Din Zengi's involvement in the Crusades.
Zengi's main role in the crusade was to be the first emir to actually attempt to retake any part of the Holy Land, and he succeeded. He did manage to take back the city of Edessa, which was a very important step, and he would have probably done a lot more, but he was assassinated. His army and forces were also so well trained and prepared and united that Saladin would eventually attempt to follow in his footsteps and retake the city of Jerusalem, which they succeeded in 1187.
Why did the Christians take part in the Crusades?
There are several reasons the Christians took part in the Crusades. The first one was that the Seljuk Turks were harassing and terrorizing their pilgrims, and so the Pope decided that as a response to that they would retake the Holy Lands. The second reason was that the Byzantine Emperor Alexius asked the Pope for help in dealing with the Seljuk Turks' expanding borders, and the Pope, sensing that he could attempt to retake some of the Byzantine Christians, decided to agree to help. The Pope also knew that the Middle East was very rich and decided that if he were to take back the Holy Lands, he would control much of the trade path and have untold riches.
Which famous Christians were involved?
There were many famous Christians that took part in the crusade, however the most notable were some of the leaders of the crusade. Some which include Peter the Hermit, who was the leader of the very unsuccessful People's Crusade, Godfrey of Bouillon, his brother Baldwin of Bouillon, and Hugh of Vermandois, also known as Hugh the Great of the First Crusade. The Second Crusade featured leaders such as Louis VII of France, Saint Bernard, and Conrad III of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. The Third Crusade featured Richard the Lionheart, Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire, and Philip II. And the Fourth Crusade's main leaders were Henry of Flanders, Baldwin of Constantinople, and Louis I.
How did some of the Christian leaders become involved?
The reason many Christian leaders took part in the crusade was mainly because the Pope pressured them into it. The Pope promised that he would excommunicate or cut off any members who did not participate in the crusades, and so many of the lords and knights just felt they had to. Lots of peasants also pressured their lords because they were enthralled by the crusades, and this was the closest they would get to going on a pilgrimage themselves. And lastly, lots of the lords and knights thought that going to a pilgrimage to Jerusalem would free them of all of their sins and allow them to enter the Holy Land of Heaven, which they viewed as the most important thing in their life.
What was a troubadour?
A troubadour was a writer or singer of the lyrical, poetry-like songs of the Middle Ages. These songs were very, very popular up until the time of the Black Plague in 1342. These singers sung three main types of songs, and they were called troubadours. Because they were so popular, these songs were used to describe the heroic tales of the Crusades.
What types of songs did they sing?
The troubadours typically sung their songs in three main types of styles: light, rich, and closed. The main themes they dealt with were chivalry and courtly love. Most were intellectual, but also vulgar and humorous.
What type of instruments did they use?
The troubadours used many instruments that were available in the medieval era, which included the medieval bagpipe, the viola, the lute, the lyre, the pan flute, and the viol.
Who were their audience?
The troubadours typically performed for knights and courts of nobles. However, they were known to perform in taverns if they had to.
When looking at the Crusades, why is it important to consider the perspectives of both sides of the many conflicts?
It's important to consider both sides of the stories and conflicts because many a time the supposed winners of a story will erase the other side's information, which could be seen in the Crusades when the Christians burned down lots of the Muslim things in Jerusalem. It is also important to consider both sides of the story because exaggeration occurs on both sides, with many conflicts being described as a sea of arrows falling over the sun, or things like that, which is why it is important to consider both sides. You should always do this with every single conflict because bias will never not be there.